Welcome to the Public Voice Salon. We're an open dialogue on culture and ideas with a particular focus on education. And it is our great honor today to feature Mr. Andrew Susskind on our show, who is the son of David Susskind, who was one of my talk show heroes growing up in the 70s and 80s, watching David Susskind shows on TV. And I read this summer, one of the books I read during the pandemic to keep me sane. I was doing a lot of reading, and I read the biography of David Susskind by Stephen Battaglia, which is a fabulous book, and it got me really thinking a lot about David and his legacy, and even in our show, and in terms of what we're trying to do to sort of bring back a kind of a more calmer dialogue that David Susskind represented, more thoughtful intellectual discourse. And to be able to get his son, is just such a great honor. And Andrew himself has had a great career also in television as a producer and director. Some of his works include Married with Children and The King of Queens and shows like that that are very popular. And he also teaches at Drexel University in the Media and Communications department. So we would just like to have a sort of wide-ranging hour with you, Andrew, and to talk about the insights into your dad and what we can learn from him that to apply to today. We look now, this is a week before the election of 2020 with Donald Trump, and we see this such polarization in our society, and people are angry and arguing, and I just think there's something about your father. There's a calmness, there's an intelligence that we're missing in the media. What do you think about that?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me, John. I appreciate that. We live in very divisive times. There's obviously no question about that. And I think the big difference between when my father had his talk show and today is not only is the public split, but the media is split. And what happens today is people are generally caught in their own bubble of information, and the media continues to feed its particular group the information they want, or probably more honestly, the slant on the information that they want. So the media plays an important part in all of this. And also, I have to say that I think the equivalence issue, where the media often points out equivalences of wrongdoing that are not actually accurate. And so, it's the what about those guys? Yeah, you say I did this, but what about you? And I do think David tried to, on his talk show, very much, he did really two kinds of shows for the most part on his talk show. One was single person interviews with really leading personages of the times, everyone from, a 3-hour, almost 4-hour interview with Nixon to Bobby Kennedy to Martin Luther King. And then he also did issue shows where he would have people on both sides of an issue on at the same time. It sometimes was very controversial. It sometimes was not comfortable, but there at least was a balance of presentation of ideas. And that is very much missing today. So that's my comment on where we are in terms of media and politics today.
Wow, wonderful beginning to our discourse. But also thinking about David and your dad and his legacy. We talk a lot about the intellectual life and culture and how that's sort of missing. I was an English major in college, full confession. I was a Fordham University English major. Donald Trump went to Fordham and studied business, whatever, people study different things. I studied literature. Then I went on to NYU for a master's degree in English education. And so my work as an educator has always been to craft dialogue in classrooms, to get people to speak and talk about culture, get people excited about literature. And that's kind of what your dad was all about, I wasn't surprised to learn in this biography that he went to Harvard, and that his father, your grandfather, took him to lectures on Sunday afternoons, to intellectual lectures. He always had that caliber. And on television, he brought Laurence Olivier to TV with programs with great actors and great theater. Even the show he did with George C. Scott, it was called East Side, West Side. It was like a cop show, but it always had social issues. I learned that George C. Scott was a great liberal. I didn't know that. So talk about that. Talk about that intellectual influence on your dad growing up in Massachusetts around Harvard, and how that affected you as a kid also growing up.
Well, as you said, my grandfather, who I never had the opportunity to meet or know, he was a very intellectually oriented person. He did love concerts. He did love lectures, and he did bring my father along when my father was a child and into Boston. My dad grew up in Brookline, Massachusetts, a suburb of Boston. But I think he and my mother too, I want to give her credit. I think they were very curious people. I think my father was intellectually curious. And the point I like to stress about his career was he was first and foremost a producer. He was there sort of at the first golden age of television, when television was predominantly live and produced in New York City before moving out to Hollywood. And his career covered both the early and live days of television, but also the film days in LA. So the talk show was actually a hobby for him. But to give you a sense of his just intellectual curiosity, he used to read the New York Times cover to cover every day. And when I say cover to cover, every article in the New York Times every day. By the way, so did my mother. The Sunday Times, which for people who have ever seen or gotten the Sunday Times, it's about that thick.
Right.
That would take him into Wednesday. But he would read every article in every section every week. And he would tear out articles or things that as either possible ideas for dramatic or comedy television shows or movies or the occasional play, but also as topics for the talk show. And the talk show he would just do on Saturdays. And one of the things I admired about him with the talk show is if he had an author on, he read the book before doing the show. So, today when I see some of the talk show hosts, not the ones who do stuff every day, because that's hard work, but the once a week, and that's their whole thing. It was my father's hobby, actually. It was his intellectual hobby.
I was so surprised to learn that when he started the show, The Open End, it would actually run like there was no time limit. I mean, it went on the air at 11 o'clock at night, and it could go till 2 o'clock in the morning, and that they were actually filming it, not in New York, but in Newark, New Jersey.
In New Jersey, right. It was the educational station studio.
Yeah.
I believe the longest interview he did was with Nixon, which was just under 4 hours.
Wow.
But these were the days, I mean, his was the last show on Sunday night. And he had the opportunity to end it whenever he thought the conversation had played itself out. And from that, they would then go to the national anthem and then the signal that would be on the air until 6 o'clock in the morning, when they would start broadcasting again. So that was why they called it Open End. I think the shortest, I think was maybe about an hour. And I don't know who that was, but I'm pretty sure they didn't, that guest never came back.
So he really believed in the power of dialogue and the power of conversation, of learning, with his guests and that whole process. So here, there's a book next to me here called Between Man and Man by Martin Buber. He's one of my great heroes, the theologian Martin Buber, who talked about the I and thou, the sacredness of dialogue. And I really think, like I said, I go back to the 70s when I was growing up, and I would channel surf, and when I came upon the Susskind show, there was something about it that was just so magical and again, very calming and very thoughtful and very different, people would talk in full sentences, and it wasn't just cut to a commercial, and there was a sense of spontaneity. And I often think that that's missing in our media today. And what do you think as a media intellectual? What do you think about that? An analysis
I'm,
of.
I'm not accepting that
Oh, okay.
title, but I'm certainly someone who's very, a consumer of media. Are you asking me about the ideas and how much they're really discussed in the marketplace of ideas? I'm not quite sure
Yeah, I guess.
what you're asking.
I'm not exactly sure either. I'm sort of trying to fumble my way towards a question of the different texture of a David Susskind show in terms of it almost feels a little bit more like an intellectual conference than today's media with the short, quick back and forth, bing bang boom, and it's like bullet points and all that kind of stuff.
His talk show lasted 27 years. Okay, and in that time, I think he changed quite a bit as a TV moderator. I think in the early years, he was known to be very opinionated, and his show certainly provided a forum for him to express his opinions, as much as his guests got to share theirs. Over time, I think he really became a terrific interviewer. I think he just got better and better at not only listening and giving the guests real opportunities to reveal themselves, but I think he also would and could ask the kinds of questions that the audience really wanted to know. And because the level or the tone of the discussion was deeper and a little more intellectual than things like the Tonight Show and the Merv Griffin show, and those were terrific shows, and occasionally there were terrific interviews, but they were meant to be entertainment, and this was really meant to be a discussion of issues. Now, he did do, to be honest, he did do shows where he had prostitutes on. He had one of the more famous ones was he had a mafia killer on. He had perhaps the most famous show where the title of it was How to Be a Jewish Son, and Mel Brooks and George Siegel and
Right.
and David
Steinberg. Steinberg.
Yeah.
Steinberg.
David Steinberg, were just hilarious. He had female impersonators. He had Elvis impersonators. So there were a lot of shows that had, kind of more fun things. But the overall purpose of the show, I think, was to have real discussions and conversations and probe the issues and people and most important people of the day.
Wow. So I want to tell you a true story, Andrew. You're our second person that we've had that's really connected to show business or talk show history. We got to know Joe Franklin, who actually invented the talk show in 1950, which I never knew. And I befriended Joe when he was 88 years old. And we got him on the show in his Times Square office, which was always a mess, and it was such an honor to be there, to be part of that showbiz, history. And now with your father, who came, a little bit later, took the talk show to a different direction. I'm just curious, it's interesting how, and here's another thing. When I was friendly with Joe, I discovered this book by Bing Crosby's son called Going My Own Way. And I gave that to Joe as a gift, and he loved it because he had Bing Crosby on his show a few times. But that book makes me think of you now in terms of your dad, in terms of being the son of a famous father. How did that play out in your career in terms of wanting to go your own way or wanting to, follow the family business, which is, show business and media and...
Someone asked me,
Yeah.
Maybe 10 or 15 years ago, gee, what was it like growing up in your father's shadow?
Yeah.
And I said, the sun was always shining where I was. I don't know what shadow you're talking about. I was very lucky. I went to schools where I was able to really establish myself. I was a pretty good athlete. I played on the teams and was captain of teams. And I was a pretty good student, and I played in the orchestra. And so I really, from an early age, I had my own identity. Now, to be sure, the rest of the world would often see me, and I'm sure my sisters, as David's children. But it really helped me. I was the only son. So it helped me to feel like I had my own identity. I think we were all extremely proud of our dad, and certainly aware of the privileged life we were living because of him. But he was the kind of dad who would say sometimes, you see how we're living? I go, yeah, Dad. He go, it has nothing to do with you. Okay, you did nothing for this. He said, I did this. I'm happy to share it with you. It's my, I'm proud and happy to be able to provide you with an education. But don't think this, this success thing has anything to do with you. So, and my mother was similar. And so I do think we were pretty well grounded. And also, frankly, because my father's fame came from a talk show, but I knew his real life was as a producer. I think we all knew that the fame was a kind of sideshow, and that his real work, that wasn't the fame. But there were two really interesting things about that for him, I think, and I especially saw this when I did early in my career work with him, which was because all the ego things we'd like to have, the good tables in restaurants, being recognized, all the kind of fun stuff of celebrity. He got through the talk show. So when it came to his actual work of producing, he didn't have the same need that a lot of producers have to say, I'm the boss, I'm the boss. He walked in a room, people knew, oh, that's the boss. And so in a way, he was quite generous in his work in really bringing people together and not only allowing for, but encouraging them to share their ideas and their skills. And so I think he was a wonderful producer. And I think some of that was because the ego gratification that people with his kind of personality, he got essentially from a hobby. Now, my own connection was, I initially did not want to go into the entertainment industry, even though I really liked it, because I didn't really want to deal with following. I thought that would be hard. And just very quickly, my father, and he was a good father, and he attended events and things like that, but he was busy a lot and traveled a lot. So I felt like we didn't know each other as well as I would have liked. And through a set of circumstances, he had lost a very important person in his company, someone he cared a great deal about and who was very important to him professionally, an executive at the company, a woman who was a hugely talented woman, Audrey Moss Geller. And he said, Audrey died and I could really use some help. Would you consider working with me? He said, and someday this could maybe be yours.
Someday all this will be yours.
Well, that's the thing. And what, of course, I didn't realize till I started working with him, there is no this. There was only what was in his head.
Right.
There was no inventory. There was no real estate. But it was a great, for a long time, it was a great experience. He was a wonderful teacher. One of my favorite, when he hired me, he said, now from time to time, I may invite you into meetings to join me. He said, on one condition. I said, what's that? He said, that you do not speak. I chuckled and said, okay, why? He said, because you have nothing to contribute.
Oh boy.
And it was a little rough hearing from your dad, but he wasn't wrong. And his point being, you got to learn stuff before you can really jump in and have opinions.
Mm.
And so I'm working with him. Uh, and then after a while, I went out to California, and I worked at what was Norman Lear's company, and I got
Oh.
into comedy stuff, and away I went.
Hmm.
I had my own career. But getting started with him was terrific.
Wow. And Norman Lear, of course, was David's cousin. So, yeah, yeah. Um, and I was surprised to learn, it was interesting that also your dad had some anger issues too. There was some, yeah.
Don't we all?
I guess. I guess.
um,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, I think what you're referring to is the late phase of his life where um, anyone who's read the book knows he certainly had some. I think he had some manic phases. I People may call it bipolar. I'm pretty sure he was not bipolar. He just went through a difficult manic time,
Hmm.
and that's very difficult to see in someone you care about.
Yeah.
A lot of times other people won't recognize it because they don't know what a person's baseline is. They just see someone of high energy and big opinions and
Mm.
aggrandizement of purpose. But
Mm.
to be honest with you, I really felt throughout my life that my father didn't show much temper,
Mm. Mm.
mainly because he didn't have to. I mean,
Right.
in his professional life, he was from a fairly young age the boss.
Mm.
In a family life, he was the boss. So he
Right.
really, honestly, did not exhibit. Could he get angry? Get angry? Yeah, but it'd be a flash, and it would really be over. One of my favorite stories was um, we were working together, and I was walking past his office, and I hear him. He's on the phone, and he's going, "No, no, no Fuji film, no."
Oh,
Because I buy American. And he slams the phone.
oh,
And I go, what was that? He goes, oh my God, we're doing this movie Peter Bogdanovich is directing. And he goes, every day it's something else. He wants something. He's got to have this. He's got to have that. He's got to have. Finally, I had to say no to something. So he said he wants to shoot the movie on Fuji film. He said, I don't know anything about film. I just had to say no. So I said, you weren't angry? He goes, no, I wasn't angry. I just had to say no. So, I mean, he probably got that way more than he ever got really angry. He faked anger when he.
uh, one of my favorite quotes about the book is by Kurt Anderson, who calls your dad one of the kings of the Mad Men era. I mean, it's hard for people today to realize how much power David Susskind had in New York. I mean, he'd walk down the street, people would say hi to him. He got the best tables at the restaurants. He was a real cultural, impresario. And again, we're in an age now of sort of fame for the sake of fame, but he was doing substantive things.
No, I think that's exactly right.
Yeah.
We the last 20 years have been a celebrity culture where people, not all, but you can become famous for just being famous.
Right.
Prior to that, fame came from either accomplishment or nefariousness. Al Capone was an accomplished
Yeah.
celebrity.
Yeah. Yeah.
So fame really only came to people who had accomplished stuff. So that's true. That's very different.
Yeah.
But one of the stories I like is, each year the major papers like the Times and the Washington Post and Time and Newsweek and those kinds of places all go to London at some point to do a thing about the theater season.
Mm.
The plays that are running this year. And when I was, I think I was either in high school or college when Newsweek did a 2-page thing on that season's theater in the West End. And the hottest ticket at that time was for a play starring, the name went out, oh gosh, I'll think it was the Hannibal, who played Hannibal Lecter?
Oh, yeah. That what? Anthony Hopkins.
Thank you. Sorry,
Okay,
sorry, folks.
yeah.
Anthony Hopkins, and he was playing literally a Rupert Murdoch kind of character. He was um, the impresario, owner of newspapers and media, and he was a tyrant and all of this. But it was the most sensational performance that year. So, so they interviewed him, and they said, "Whom did you base your character on? Of this, horrible but powerful man?" And he said, "Well, I based it on three people." He said the first was Bela Lugosi,
Ah,
who 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 played the vampire when I was growing up. He was the scariest um, fictional character. I also based it partly on Adolf Hitler, who was in my lifetime the true apotheosis of evil. He
mm,
said, and the third was David Susskind, who always
oh,
with the perfect cuffs and the cufflinks,
right.
but who could be a terror. So I called my dad up and I said, "Gee,
Oh,
Dad, I just read Newsweek." He goes, "Oh, I know. Geez, me and Hitler is so
oh
terrible."
no.
I said, "Dad, it's the problem is that you compared to Hitler was the problem is your billing. He had you ranked third."
Oh no. Oh, gee.
But I mean, he had a good laugh over it.
Yeah.
Oh no, me and
Oh
Hitler. Oh
no.
God.
Andrew, in terms of your own identity, though, in terms of that, like as the son of David Susskind, do you ever think sometimes, gee, boy, I could go out there and be as famous as my father? Or how does that, or in terms of finding your vocation and as now a professor of media and as a producer, is that something?
Something I never. Fame was never something that I particularly wanted to go after.
Mm,
And I'll tell you this: David's fame was a very unique kind of fame, not like today. There weren't paparazzis. People weren't hanging outside where we lived. It was a respected, his fame was sort of as an intellectual or something. You know what I
ah,
mean? So there was people would come to the table at a restaurant.
yes.
Sometimes they'd sit down,
Okay.
you know, and there's a difference between television fame and movie fame. Movie fame is like, oh look, there's Tom Cruise.
Yeah, right.
But
Right.
on television, you're in their living room. So, oh, look who's here. It's David Susskind. Come on, honey. Let's sit down at the table.
Ah,
They'd ask for autographs, but there was no craziness attached to it.
right, right.
And by the way, even though the show played in most of the country, it wasn't like, he was on Friends or anything, so it was a very respectful kind of fame, and it was low key. It certainly got him good tables at restaurants and things like that, but it was very low key. But fame ain't what it's cracked up to be. There are some lovely things that come along with fame, no question about it. But today's fame,
Mm,
I don't think is comfortable for anybody.
mm, mm.
You know,
Wow. Do you think in some ways Donald Trump represents that? Represents a kind of nadir, a kind of jumping of the shark of this phony fame for the sake of fame? Because he wouldn't be president if he wasn't famous first.
that's true. And I have a theory about his election, which is
Mm,
I believe his candidacy was treated by the New York media, and New York is the center of media,
still, yeah.
as a kind of circus show because it was very entertaining and it got, you know, high ratings. But everybody at the sort of upper levels of New York society and business industry knew that he was full of crap. That he had inherited all that money. That would not pay his construction people. That they knew he was really what I think he really is. But he was great television. I think had the media ever thought seriously that he could win,
Mm,
I think the coverage of him would have been very, very different and much tougher. Um,
mm.
but he was in millions of people's living rooms week after week after week. And that breeds a kind of familiarity, the kind of familiarity that, when I was growing up, meant people would come and sit at our table. They just felt comfortable doing that. He portraying himself as a super rich guy had a little bit of, ooh, there's Donald Trump. But I think the New York media would have, and certainly should have, been more taken his candidacy more seriously. And I'm not saying he wouldn't have won, but the reporting and the scrutiny would have been much tougher than it was.
Well, one of the things we're trying to do with our show, Andrew, is to be an educational force, to sort of advocate for the humanities. I see that you're also involved in educational nonprofits as well, and you get involved. You're in an organization that's trying to reimagine how Latinos are perceived.
The Imagen organization. Yeah.
Maybe you could talk a little bit about your educational work. Yeah.
Well. Like much of my career, some of that is behind me. I was on the board and the president of my children's elementary school. I was very privileged in terms of my education. I went to private schools,
Phillips Exeter Academy,
elementary and high school and college.
Yeah,
and I was very privileged, to do so. And I became very interested in education, both from the places I'd gone to school. And then when I had children, I got very involved in their school education. I was invited to join the Imagen organization in LA, which seeks to improve media's representation of Latina and Latinos, Latinx, I guess is.
Yeah.
That was a very interesting part of my life out in LA because, the portrayals of Hispanics and Asians and Blacks have been, for the most part, over the history of television, pretty poor. And, finally communities have kind of stood up and, Hollywood is just now really starting to come around, and not cast Hispanics as drug dealers and, that kind of thing. And I was involved briefly with a wonderful organization called Facing History and Ourselves, which has a whole program designed to help schools teach issues of racism and bias and by doing exercises and confronting these things at a fairly early age. We need all the help we can get, I think, to confront these issues in our society.
Wow. One of the colleges I taught at was in Newark, New Jersey, Essex County College, and trying to help my students find a voice. Most of them were poor Black students of color, and I would put them in a circle, and it was the first time they ever taught like in a circle. They were always like sitting in rows, and it was such a liberating experience for them to be able to find their voices and tell their stories and then begin to critique the power structure, to bring in politics into the teaching as well. And then I just learned from your reading this book about your dad that right down the street on Broad Avenue there was David Susskind with his open end, 11 o'clock at night till 2 o'clock in the morning, having these open dialogues. It's interesting how television can be a force of education or miseducation. And I always, that's one reason we created the shows, because we felt like there's not enough educational material on TV. What would you say, like Channel 13 still has good stuff? Charlie Rose is off the air because he had a problem there with his thing that he had a scandal that he's now off the air. But there is really not the level of your dad. I keep circling back to that in terms of what we see as a dumbing down in the society, a large-scale dumbing down over the past 30 years. Your dad left us way too soon. He was only 66 years old, and it would be great if he would have stuck around another 20, 30 years, to have that kind of level of discourse in the media. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Um, well, I think partly we don't see that kind of show much anymore. Partly because of the divisive nature of our society right now. Part of the responsibility of that kind of show was to present both sides.
Mm.
I'm not sure people are really wanting to hear both sides right now. I think it also takes a kind of commanding personality, maybe, to make that work. Um, and I think maybe people are turning to television more to be entertained.
Mm.
And even, some of the news is done in a more entertaining way,
Mm.
or trying to, my God, you look at the screen, if you're watching MSNBC or CNN or Fox,
Yeah.
things are going back and forth and, like razzle dazzle. Um, and I think that contributes to our lack of patience. Excuse me, there's an audience for the Sunday morning t- political talk shows, not a huge one. Um, but to sit down and have a conversation, and one of the things about David's show was that it
Mm.
covered such a breadth of topics. And that was really him. He was a very intellectually curious person, and whether it was medical or tech, technological stuff, or the arts, politics, history, he just had a breadth of interest, and wanted to present that. Now, to be fair, it was on mostly on public television around the country. I mean, it was on some independent stations. Most interesting, New York, it was on the Channel 5. Um, so he didn't have the same kind of pressure for ratings. It didn't make any money. He pretty much subsidized the show.
Mm. Mm.
Um, so it didn't have the kinds of pressures that almost anything on television today has to face. Even the MSNBC, Fox, CNN, they need ratings. They need sponsors. David's show didn't have those worries or pressures. So there are the realities of the economics of television that we can't ignore when we're talking about what's up with media today. They have, for the most part, corporate owners. Corporate owners want maximized profits.
Mm.
It's kind of most obvious if you follow the history of media stuff in the movie business. When huge corporations own movie studios, they would rather spend 250, $300 million on Spider-Man 6 with the chance they think of making $1 billion than making Juno for 5 million and it makes 60 or 70. You and I'd be pretty happy with, and other smaller companies would be pretty happy to spend 5 million and make 60 or 70. But the big corporations that own the studios and own the networks, they want and arguably need big profits, and that's a pressure. That is a barrier to doing more interesting, more intellectual. Movie studios don't make the smaller movies anymore.
Mm.
It's independent movie makers, or for some of the big companies, they have offshoots that specialize in that. But the costs are, there was a book, I believe it was David Halberstam's book,
Mm.
on the media, and there's a line in there. Bill Moyers had been a very successful commentator and interviewer for them, and this is when William Paley was still running the network, and they canceled Bill Moyers' show, which was, a critic's darling. It never had huge ratings, but it was very prestigious. And Moyers went to see Paley and said, "Mr. Paley, I mean, and he said, 'I can't do it, Bill. A minute costs too much.'"
Uh,
And that was William Paley, who had started it and who had believed in quality and supported quality television. And
mm,
that's what that's 50 years ago.
mm,
Okay. And it had gotten too commercial then. So now today,
wow.
when GE owned NBC, and they're a $60 billion a year company, and in NBC's best year they made 500 million. GE goes, oh, that's nice. um, keep it up. But they don't want to make 300 million the next year, because then it's like, we made 500, why didn't we make 500 again? And then they said, you know what, screw it, we're getting rid of NBC. It's not worth it to us. So
Wow. So, Andrew, I'm going to share a story with you now because I'm also a show business scion of sorts. My grandmother's second mother was a great actress, a great forgotten actress named Blanche Walsh, who brought my grandmother to America from London. She rescued my grandmother from an orphanage, brought her to New York when she was 7 years old, and Walsh was, in the Belle Epoque period, or the first progressive era, 1895 to 1910, she was the #1 star on Broadway, and she was also the original advocate of a national theater. She came up with this idea with Mark Twain, who was a friend, and she wanted Mark Twain to help promote it, and he said, no, I prefer to scatter the seeds and let others do the cultivation. So she went on the stump arguing that America should have a national theater, a chain of theaters nationwide where regular folks could see serious plays at a low cost. And once a week there would be an intellectual lecture. This was her dream. This was her baby. She died young at the age of 42, but back in the 30s, there was a sort of incarnation of what her dream was called the Federal Theater Project. They sort of, keep it low, cost and all that, and it was very progressive. They did plays like It Can't Happen Here by Sinclair Lewis, about what would happen if fascism came to America. And they were defunded by the Republicans in Congress who felt it was too left-wing. So there have been attempts in the past.
it's like the line from Casablanca, shocked that they're scamming. The Republicans wanting to end that? Oh, shocking.
And what you said before about the media, we have to be sort of skeptical, but I think it's a real false equivalency to put Fox and MSNBC. I think Fox has gone so far, what do you think, to the right, almost they become like the state television. They're completely behind Trump. There's no to say. What do you think about Fox?
Well, to be fair, I don't watch Fox, and I don't watch Fox because first of all, I don't share that political view.
Yeah.
But I also feel they don't often deal in facts. And whether it was Moynihan or whoever, you can have your opinions, but you can't have your own facts. And I mean, I knew Roger Ailes a smidge.
Okay.
And he was a brilliant, brilliant guy, no question about it. But that wasn't always news. And they did become and have become the spokespeople for not only Republicans, but pretty far right Republicans. And I just don't respect that. Now, to me, you hit on something that I think is absolutely a huge issue, which is false equivalency. That's what I was alluding to earlier. I think that's a big problem. It's not, this is not the same as that. They're not the same. I think the media has had a very tough time dealing with Trump because he lies. And it isn't that they don't recognize that, but they don't call it that. They've come very, very late in the game to actually identify and call something a lie. You say, it's inaccurate. It's, he misspoke. No, there are things that are lies, but it's in this day and age, it becomes, it's the false equivalency of Biden, saying the wrong name of someone, or, they're not the same. Now, I consider myself a liberal Democrat, and I watch MSNBC quite a bit. But for myself, I know when it's opinion and when it's fact. I don't begrudge them having their opinions, and for me, I don't mind that it all gets kind of mixed in together. But I know what's a fact, and I know when they're sharing their opinion. I think too often we get caught up in the opinion and take that as fact, or what is opinion they are presenting as facts. So I mean, the COVID virus is a terrific example. When Trump was calling it a hoax, Fox called it a hoax.
Right.
Okay. And he continued to call it a hoax, and they continued to call it a hoax. They broke away from that sooner than he did, So that's troubling when that's presented. I mean, a hoax, I don't care what you think, almost always calling something a hoax is probably an opinion. It doesn't mean it's not true, but a hoax is almost a judgment of something, a subjective judgment. If it turns out to be true, then it's a lie, right? I mean, it's no longer a hoax, it's a lie, it's a falsehood. So I do think, unfortunately, we're living in that, and I don't want to blame it all on Fox. I think Fox, I'm a lifelong Democrat, okay? I can sum up in a sentence or 3 sentences what the Republican Party is about. Small government, lower taxes, strong defense. That's been their bumper sticker my entire life. Try doing that with the Democrats. There's no bumper sticker that tells you what the Democrats stand for.
There's that famous saying, right? Will Rogers said that. He said, "I don't belong to any organized party. I'm a Democrat." Yeah, right.
I'm a Democrat.
That's right.
I think I was a government major, an American government major in college. So I come from the thing is, I don't believe American voters are stupid. I think most voters know where their candidate stands on an issue or issues that are important to them. They may not understand somebody's economic policy, but they know where they stand on choice, pro-choice, or okay. If you're a farmer, you may not know what international foreign relations are. You know what the farm subsidies are and the international price of soybeans. They know what's most important to them and where candidates stand. But we live in an age of such complexity.
Yes.
That no one in the world can understand trading relationships and the significance of how that impacts, human rights. It's just all too simple. And my main problem with Republicans, absent the Trump era and all that stuff, is they are intellectually disingenuous. They know how complicated these issues are. They really do. But they talk about them as though they're simple. And they do it because for a lot of people, it's just much easier to, small government, lower taxes, strong defense. I'm for that. But the complexities, the nuances, there probably aren't 10 people in America who really understand the complexities of foreign policy. I mean, it's just.
Yeah. I took a course in foreign policy at Bergen Community College. That was my first college. I got 30 credits there, and one of the courses I took was American foreign policy. I took a lot of courses in history. I probably could have been a history minor, but I wound up as an English major with a lot of history courses. So again, we try to advocate for the liberal arts, for the humanities, and we think that's what your father was about and his work and his legacy. One quick story I have to share before we go is Claudia and I were in a vintage clothing store in Jersey City 2 years ago and looked up on the wall, and we saw a picture of your dad on the wall with a woman. And I was like, hey, you know who that is? And the people working there didn't even know who that was. But the owner of the shop said, yeah, the woman in the picture, she donated all our clothes to the store. This was a female friend, and she donated the clothes. And I was telling this woman how much David Susskind meant to me. She didn't even know who he was. I said, no, this guy was the king of the talk shows, and I grew up watching him, you know. You know what she did? She took it off the wall and she gave it to me as a gift. She said, you need to have this, and here is the photograph right here.
Okay. I don't know the woman.
Okay.
Um,
That's it's like a spiritual thing, you know, and now we have this
No, it's a
hanging
very
in our
sweet
foyer.
story.
It was like, this was like so strange, you know, like your dad was like, you know, up there. So as we wind up, closing thoughts also about your work. I'm sorry we didn't touch more on your work. You worked on Married with Children. You want to say a few words about King, you know, the one about the King of Queens?
Well, I directed an episode of King of Queens that was a lot of fun. Married with Children was, you know, a hoot to do. I mean, to whatever extent your audience knows Married with Children, the one thing that they might enjoy knowing is it really started. I had seen a stand-up, Sam Kinison stand-up, and Roseanne Barr stand-up.
Yes.
And I met with these two writers, Ron Levitt and Michael Moy, and I said, imagine those two married to each other. And that sort of led to Married with Children on the very new Fox network, which, by the way, Married with Children has the distinction of having been the very first show to air on the Fox network the first night that they were on the air, and ran for 11 years. So the people who believed that Fox as a network would never succeed and that the early shows would never succeed, they did pretty well.
Mm-hmm. And when you look back on your work, you did a special on Rita Hayworth.
Yeah, a movie of the week for CBS.
For the movie of the week, I grew up with movies of the week. Did your dad?
Linda Carter played.
Linda Carter,
Rita
yes.
Hayworth.
Okay.
Who famously said, you know, all the men in her life went to bed with Gilda and woke up with her.
Oh, Rita Hayworth said that. Okay, all right. It's been said that your dad also was quite a ladies' man in his own way, right? He sort of had a fondness for women, but he was also very pro-women, and they said in his studio, he had more women working in his studio than anywhere else, and the women loved to work with David.
Well, he gave women executives a lot of responsibility. Now, the knock was, you know, he could pay them less. Well, maybe, but he also was making women executives and producers and associate producers before, you know, that became a thing. And many of the women who went on to have really important careers, including, like, for example, Sherry Lansing, who wound up running Fox, I think it was, you know, began at David's company.
Wow.
And they became casting directors and studio executives and producers. And
oh. I feel like I have so much I want to ask you or say to you because the time is running out. Do you remember any of the famous parties at the UN Plaza? That's where your dad...
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, my father and stepmother, Joyce, they weren't big party givers, but they had an amazing party, an engagement party. Or maybe it was right after they got married. Maybe it was a wedding party.
Okay.
And my dad had bought this apartment at the UN Plaza, but we hadn't moved in, so there was no furniture or anything. And all these celebrities came and they wrote on the walls. Bobby Kennedy was there. Truman Capote was there. I believe Walter Cronkite was there. I mean, it was Arnold Scazzi and other fashion designer. Oscar de la Renta was there. I mean, it was quite something. I was at the door. I took people's coats.
Okay.
I think I was like 11.
Right.
But they wrote on the walls. And then, of course, subsequently, you know, I think my stepmother had the walls done and either repainted or whatever. So it would have been fantastic to take pictures of what they wrote. But that was a pretty great party.
Johnny Carson.
Oh, Johnny Carson. Of course,
Carson used to swing by, play the drums. He would play the drums, right? He would play.
Yeah, not at the party. But he had a drum set at his house.
Okay. Okay, some of your favorite talk show hosts, like, David Letterman, even, what are your thoughts on other, just Howard Stern, what are your thoughts?
Howard Stern is a fantastic interviewer.
Yes.
Fantastic.
I agree. I agree.
Some of the shenanigans, whatever, but he's a brilliant guy. And my God, I think he's the best interviewer going.
And he
really is great.
I read something about him recently where he wants to do away with a lot of the shtick and really focus on having more meaningful dialogue.
And he's fantastic. I mean, he draws so much out of his guests. He's fabulous. Really, other than his interview, there's no one whose interviewing skills I think come up to David's. Really,
you are the one to judge.
I guess I'm biased.
So what about having a talk show? What if you got a call from ABC or NBC and said, we want to have you come on and do a talk show?
If I were ever going to do a talk show, I think I'd like to do one like yours. I don't think I want to do ABC, NBC, CBS. Too much.
Yeah.
Too much stuff you have to do. Stars promoting their books and. Interestingly, Bill Maher, whom I knew when he was a stand-up comedian.
Okay.
When he knew he was going to be doing the talk show for ABC, he asked me to get him, if I could, some of David's old tapes, and I did.
Oh, yes.
And I honestly, I think Bill's pretty good. His show is chopped up, and he is a comedian, so he kind of has to always make sure there's some humor going. But he's smart as hell, and but Stern is, as an interviewer, the best.
Wow. Well, in preparation for today's show, I watched your dad's show with Dick Cavett. I watched a little bit of the show with Germaine Greer, which was very controversial. They went at it on that one. And I watched the one with, who was the guy? William F. Buckley.
No, that was actually Buckley's show that you saw.
Yeah.
It was Buckley's talk show. Can I end with one funny quick story?
Please, Andrew. Yes.
I was working with my dad, and he came in the office one day. He said, "Guess what? They've asked me to go on NBC on Saturday Night Live." I said, "Wow, that's so cool, Dad. What are you going to do?" He said, "I'm going to interview Buckley. It's going to be great. I can't wait. I'm going to get that guy."
I'm back.
Sure enough, that night I watched, and when it gets to them, he's interviewing Buckwheat. Eddie Murphy has Buckwheat. You could tell. The audience could tell, but I could tell in his eyes he didn't know what the hell. He didn't know who Buckwheat was. He didn't know Eddie Murphy was. He thought he was going to do a gag thing with William F. Buckley. Anyway.
Oh, that's funny. Andrew, this has been such a delight. It's been a great pleasure to be in dialogue with you for this past hour. We certainly hope you might come back in the future, maybe as part of a roundtable talking about media.
Well, with COVID, I only leave the house for food, booze, and drugs, same as always. So, I'll be here.
And how do you like Philly? You're in Philly, right?
Yeah, Philly ain't great right now, but it's it's a cool city. It has city problems.
Yes.
But it has arts and public transportation and fascinating people, and it's a medical center, it's an intellectual center with but we have intractable problems. Public school, it's a city that has, I believe it has the highest proportion of citizens in poverty of any major city in America. But it also has such great potential. And the food's pretty good.
Well, thank you so much, Andrew, for being our guest today, and we wish you well, and stay safe.
All right, you too, John, and best to Claudia. Thank you so much.
Claudia's right here. She say hi.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care, Andrew. Be well. Okay.